Good morning and welcome to the Spectator's Alternative Conference, streaming live on Spectator TV. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne and I'm the Deputy Director of the Adam Smith Institute. I'm privileged to be joined this morning for a debate about Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK, a new union, by the leader of the official opposition of Canada, Erin O'Toole. It's very early where you are, Erin, so just after 6 in the morning, so thank you enormously for joining us. Erin has been the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada since August of this year and was served as Minister of Veterans Affairs in 2015 and has been a member of the Parliament for Durham since 2012. Erin made CANZUK a key plank of his offer to the Conservative Party members in the leadership election this year. Also joining us are Alicia Kearns, the Conservative MP for Rutland and Melton, elected in December of last year and who is the Deputy Chair of the APPG on CANZUK. And finally, we're joined in what is the evening for him by Senator James Paterson, an Australian senator representing the state of Victoria. Senator Paterson is the chair of both the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Corporations and Financial Services and the Senate Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee, which is a hell of a mouthful for spending a lot of money, and deputy chair of the Select Committee on COVID-19, an important man. So he was also the only federal politician in Australia to publicly support Brexit prior to the 2016 referendum. And he's the author of A Ripper Deal, the case for free trade and free movement between Australia and the United Kingdom, which we released at the Adam Smith Institute earlier this year as well. Now, CANZUK has been long known as an acronym in international circles and at the United Nations, where the Canadian, Australia, New Zealand, and UK governments have acted in tandem on issues for decades, and together make up the non-US section of the Five Eyes intelligence and security sharing community. However, movements have recently set up in each state at the civil society level to push for greater freedoms for the citizens of each to live and work between the other states. They argue that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK each share the same language, the same Westminster parliamentary system, the same respect for common law, and the same sovereign. The four modern states are liberal, diverse, mature democracies that trust one another, and whose citizens are well integrated and feel at home in each. So is it time to update the rights of citizens to match the aspirations and the comfort of what is a proposition whose time has come, or is it something that's looking into the past? And so what I will do is I'll set up as we look to Britain leaving the European Union and finally at the end of this year, and also looking at what the relations of the four countries should be in an ever regionalizing world. I'll ask Erin O'Toole to set out why he made it such a key pillar of his campaign to members of the Conservative Party of Canada earlier this year. Over to you, Erin.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure for me to join here early in the morning from Canada. And the very fact that we have James in Australia in the evening, Alicia and yourself in the UK, myself here, talking about CANZUK, talking about a modern version of the Anglosphere reminds me of the old expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And it feels like that with the participation we have with everyone on here tonight. And look, I've been talking about CANZUK for over 3 years now. Like many good Tory leaders, I didn't win the first time I ran for the leadership of the Tory party here in Canada. I placed third out of 15 or so characters in the last race. And really the policy that resonated the most from my campaign 3 years ago was CANZUK. And it grew mainly out of conversations I'd had here in Canada, sparked by the Brexit debate in the UK. And Canada had just finalized under Prime Minister Harper, a European free trade agreement between Canada and the EU. And there were already discussions here in Canada about what we would do post-Brexit to ensure that our closest relation out of the previous deal with CETA, what would we do with the UK in the event that the Brexit vote happened? We had the CETA agreement, but we didn't have a standalone UK agreement. And what was remarkable at the time for me was there was a young expat Brit living in Vancouver, of all places, James Skinner, who had started an online movement called CANZUK International. And so when I was in Vancouver, James and I sat down, and it was remarkable to see how much grassroots interest amongst all of the countries, there was for an update to the Anglosphere or an update to the Commonwealth 2.0 in the era of Brexit, and in the era where I like to say we need aspirational multilateralism, where we have closely aligned countries that share like values, share a history, a language, a commitment to the rule of law and parliamentary democracy, to do more together at a time where many people are seeing international multilateral work becoming a race to the bottom at some of the international fora. So the concept of a CANZUK, which has been out there for decades in various forms, was very appealing, particularly to young people, where there's the ability to live, work, have the free exchange of people, capital, ideas, and to show that multilateralism can be a force for good when it comes to security and opportunity for the peoples of Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and Canada. I used to say it's 4 of the 5 I's, which is our closest alignment of intelligence sharing and security cooperation. So I've been talking about it for many years, and when I ran for leader again, it of course became centerpiece to my policy campaign. And I really think right now Canada's at a disadvantage with Prime Minister Trudeau, because these conversations in various forms are happening post-Brexit with Australia and New Zealand. And sadly, under our current Prime Minister, Canada's not at the table whatsoever. So if Canada we're in a minority parliament here in Canada, we will have an election probably sometime in the next 6 months. Our party, the Tory party in Canada, is pledging to be a participant in a CANZUK type agreement between the countries. It will be centerpiece in terms of our platform, and I'm certainly optimistic that we have a very good chance of winning the next election and then joining our allies in discussions about really taking this relationship to the next level at a time where I think it's desperately needed. So there's a lot of interest here in Canada, and that's why I'm up at the crack of dawn to talk about it today.
And thank you very much for doing that. I know that actually it's an official plank of your campaign, and thank you for also bringing up the current Prime Minister and whether he's actually doing enough. It's also an official policy of the Nationals in New Zealand, and ACT as well in New Zealand. So it's becoming a bit more of the scene out there. Alicia, in the UK Conservative Party, it's been an issue that's been growing and growing. The recent APPG, the backbench group on this, has just been set up. How likely is this an idea that could be taken up by the leadership at the UK Conservative Party?
I mean, this is an idea that has to be taken up by the leadership, and I'm all to creating that future alliance that Erin set out so beautifully. There is real passion for this within the party. There's real passion for it within the country. The Adam Smith Institute has done research on this that shows that to be the case. And it's really interesting because the only antis I hear, the only apologists, are essentially UK Labour Party MPs who suggest this is some kind of neo-colonial white nationalist project, which is just so completely offensive in every single way. We are countries that embrace diversity and multiculturalism. Look at the EU project, that's made up of 27 mainly white countries, and no one would ever suggest such a thing. And so I'm really keen that we are robust on this and step forward and say, this is a really fascinating time of opportunity for our nation. We need to step up, we need to embrace it, we need to cast off the shackles of people who are trying to make us apologists for the friends that we keep. And we do have an incredible affinity. I don't think there's any nations in the world that have the affinity that the CANZUK ones do. And as Erin said, in a time where we need to stand strong for our values and the international rule of law, it's really important that CANZUK exists, not only so that UK can take its place in the world stage as an independent nation, but so that Western liberal nations can fight together, stand together in trade, diplomatically, in military circles, and stand strong for what we believe in. And we all recognise that this is a time where we are under a threat from hybrid warfare. And actually, CANZUK can work together on science, on space, on education. There are so many things where we already do work together. It's Australia that all my friends who are experts in space are going over to Perth to work on. We need to make the most. When I was working in the military in the Global Coalition Against Daesh, which of course all CANZUK members are, whenever I was in a military base anywhere in the world, it was the CANZUK colleagues that came together, not just for socializing, but actually for working together, because we have a natural affinity, the same values, the same kind of priorities. And why would you throw away such an affinity? And I think that's the recognition that's coming together in the Conservative Party as we start to stand strong and say, we have a new future, we have a new opportunity, and CANZUK absolutely has to be a central tenet of that.
Thank you very much. James, we've got Bojo in number 10, we've got ScoMo in Canberra. They ran on very similar electoral platforms. They're very similar in terms of outlook on what life can mean. Have we got an opportunity with the FTA? Is it being taken advantage of well enough by the two governments with so close affinities to deliver the promise of CANZUK that people want both in Australia and the UK?
Thanks, Matt. And can I just say at the outset what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with Alicia and with Erin. They're two parliamentarians who I admire greatly for their advocacy, not just of this issue, but actually a concern that the three of us share very closely as well, which is the Chinese Communist Party. And we could just as easily be on a panel with the three of us talking about that as well. And although it's not the topic of today's discussion, I think it's an underlying factor which is contributing to the resurgence of this idea and the popularity of this idea. I'm a free trader. I want Australia to trade with every country in the world, but I want our economic relationships to be particularly close with our long-standing trusted friends and allies, with people who we share values with people who we would never fear they would use our trade against us, who'd never engage in economic coercion against us, which unfortunately the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And in an age of rising authoritarianism, then finding like-minded allies, but binding together and working together is a sensible thing to do. What I think some people don't appreciate is that the building blocks are really there for a CANZUK agreement. Australia already effectively has a CANZUK agreement just with New Zealand. We have complete freedom of movement of people and of trade and capital. There's no barriers between us. The World Trade Organization has called that trade agreement the best trade agreement in the world. Both New Zealand and Australia are right now negotiating free trade agreements with the UK. All we need to do is add Canada to that, and effectively the building blocks are there. And it wouldn't take much effort at all to link those 4 trade agreements up between each country and call it CANZUK and have that agreement. So we're closer than we've ever been. We know it's now possible because of Brexit. The challenge is to seize the opportunity. I think there's real growing groundswell of support for it here in Australia. As Erin said, it's particularly exciting for young people who want to have those opportunities to travel and study and work in like-minded countries with the same language and legal system and political culture. The challenge is just to seize that opportunity, and I think we're very, very close.
And Erin, how do you think that the CANZUK states should try and respond to China as a threat?
Well, great point, and it's my pleasure to share the stage with like-minded friends. And I will just build on one of James' points. It is very easy if there would be some leadership on the Canadian front, because Australia, New Zealand, Canada were part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks together in terms of trade, and while the US withdrew, the rest of us had been at the table. And of course, the relationships between Australia, New Zealand, and Canada within that larger block of trade discussions were very strong, even though we had some issues like milk and other dairy products as rubs. The relations were always strong. Going on to China, I think this is another reason for it. I agree with James. This is part of an underlying wider interest in CANZUK at this time, because of the global disruption caused by the Communist Party of China and how they have used trade in a predatory fashion. And it has been interesting for Canada to watch the leadership of Australia, to be honest with you, in terms of being in the immediate sphere of influence and being much more straight up with respect to concerns about Beijing. All the countries have deep concerns with what's happening in Hong Kong. Canada in World War II, we lost our sons there trying to defend Hong Kong. We had 2 battalions that tried desperately to fend off the Japanese. So we all have deep personal ties. There's 300,000 Canadian citizens who live in Hong Kong. There's more, we call it our 10th province. There's more Canadians living in Hong Kong than in our small province of Prince Edward Island, for example. So I think that Prime Minister Trudeau has been remarkably mute on this subject. And I think Australia, in some ways, has been at the forefront of the CANZUK countries in terms of pushing for a stronger international response. And I think it's having an effect. I remember even conversations between Alicia and I with respect to Huawei. I think the Five Eyes and the CANZUK should have taken a united position on the participation of Huawei in our 5G critical infrastructure networks. And I really do think that the positions taken by Australia and New Zealand eventually influenced the UK's decision, along with the backbench, I think, influencing the decision. Canada, of course, is still sitting out there having not made a decision. So I think with China's tradition of trying to isolate countries and apply pressure through the size of their economic clout, the more we have this alignment on critical issues like Huawei actually helps us weather that tactic from China. So I do think this is probably the most compelling reason for why we have to turn CANZUK from a great concept into a reality.
And speaking of the reality, Alicia and James, how would the flow of people look like? One of the things that we've seen in the Brexit debate was concerns over large numbers of people who maybe lived different lifestyles, different cultures from other groups of people, whether the pace of change was acceptable or not to voters. What was the realistic, what does a CANZUK union end up looking like to the average the average citizen in each of your states? And shall we start with the UK first?
It's really important that the Conservative Party, and indeed every party in the UK pretty much, is pro-immigration. It's about having the right immigration that bolsters us not just economically, but also bolsters us in terms of culturally and kind of opportunities for our nation to grow. With CANZUK, I think a lot of the questions or concerns around migration go out the window because we already have, as Erin and James have said, these shared values, these shared concepts of the rule of law. Our democratic systems are very similar. We share the same sovereign. I believe that I think the most sensible way ahead, given that the UK has set out we'll be going with a points-based system, would it be a specific CANZUK visa? I think that's probably the most sensible way to go ahead. Because obviously, given that we've decided to go with that model, I think free movement doesn't necessarily come naturally to that. I would be a natural supporter of free movement between CANZUK nations, but I think the most sensible and pragmatic and the trans-Tasman travel model, but moving it to a kind of specific CANZUK visa.
And James, how do you think Australia, as a political reality, would respond to the idea, more generally, the idea of increasing?
Well, there's about a
Trans-Tasman agreement to also include Canada in the UK.
Exactly. I mean, that's the key point, Matt, is that Australia already has this relationship with New Zealand and it works remarkably well. Kiwis are an integrated part of Australian life. And in fact, even without this agreement with the UK, there's about 1 million people of UK descent living in Australia. So I don't think much would change from our point of view. Actually, what would probably happen more easily is young Australians going to London to have that experience that they historically used to have in the last century, but which has dropped dramatically in the last 20 years as a result of the UK's legitimate desire to control its immigration, but its previous inability to restrict it from EU member states, which means its only ability to restrict it has been to non-EU member states like Australia. And I think that's been a really perverse outcome where Australians who are by YouGov polls the most popular type of migrant and visitor to the UK have been the ones that have suffered the most through EU membership of the UK. So getting out of the EU gives you the opportunity to control those things, control over your trade and control over your immigration. And why not pick other countries like Australia and Canada, where there's so much in common, not just language and culture and common understanding, but respect for the rule of law that we know, and similar levels of economic development, that we know that our migrants are going to move freely between each of those 4 jurisdictions, really without any trouble at all.
And also, I just add, Matt, we have to remember that 80% more Brits live in CANZUK nations than live in the EU. And that's a stat that people don't talk about. And it just makes it so obvious when you say that CANZUK is where British people want to live when they live abroad. And so therefore we have to facilitate that and make it easier for them to come to the UK as well.
That's certainly true. It's one of those things where we talk about sort of the gravity model of trade, but actually there's a gravity model of immigration as well, where you move where you have family links, where you have your auntie Val live or your cousin lives already. And even if you're from a British Indian background, British Caribbean background, Cantonese background, you're more likely to have family members who live in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada than you do with sort of anywhere else that the UK currently has very liberal immigration laws with. In terms of, we talk about, in many ways, obviously you're all from parties of the right. Realistically, if this is to become an issue that is settled as a national project for each of the states, it has to be a project that reaches across the aisle. And Erin, in Canada's case, it also has to be a project that reaches Quebec as well, as a non-English speaking part of Canada. How do we do that? How do we make sure that left-wingers and people who aren't from an English speaking background are appealed to as well?
Well, that's a great point. I do think there's a unique window right now with the governments in Australia and the UK, that if we did have a Conservative government join the club from Canada, so to speak, it would facilitate discussions that I think are really easy once there's the political will to make them happen. And within our own country, certainly we have the French and English, and Quebec traditionally has not had the same level of affinity with the monarchy and that part of our history. But Quebecers are a free trading peoples within Canada as well. And I think there is a sense that the more we can have free trade that's aligned with our values and that advances Canadian interests broader than just economic interests, I think there is that interest. And I'll tell you, the cultural ties and connections are so deep that I think the education and early work years of the young citizens of all of our countries are the way to make this work. I already think, we joke that in British Columbia, the Whistler Ski Resort is essentially run by Australians in their year. We've had some degree of student exchange and student work programs between the countries. But if we could have this mobility, and perhaps even having the universities within each of our countries treat CANZUK members almost like domestic for tuition purposes, or have it as a preference over international tuition rates, I think you would see really younger people taking the lead in terms of this opportunity to be educated, to work, to gain that experience, and then potentially learn with those ties and connections. And I think Quebecers, people from all parts of Canada, want that opportunity. And this is what I say, when I call it aspirational multilateralism, you're showing benefits that flow to the individual person and not just state to state benefits. So I think there would be real interest. I think also once the negotiations, or once the loose agreement is in place, it would be so beneficial that there would be no risk of, in our case, the Liberal Party changing course. I know the Liberal Party in Australia is a little different than our Liberal Party in Canada, but I don't think you would see a change in government leading to lack of interest in CANZUK. I think that the chances of it being lined up, though, through Conservative aligned parties is more realistic.
And James, building practical steps, treaties aside, how do we build, I like the idea of the sort of CANZUK Erasmus that you were sort of mentioning there, and how do we build those civil society links, or rebuild them in many respects after decades of neglect?
Well, Matt, I was going to make a very similar point to the point that Erin just made, which is that this certainly has been a project largely of the centre-right politically so far, and it has its best chance if we get Conservative governments elected in Canada and New Zealand in their upcoming elections. But it's one of those ideas that once initiated, it would never be reversed. It would be almost impossible to think that a government would campaign on an issue of abolishing CANZUK and taking away from people that freedom to travel and to work and to study in these like-minded countries, and that in an age where the world is becoming less stable, not more stable, that you would want to drive a stake between allies and between like-minded countries. one of the most interesting things over the last few months is the way in which the Five Eyes network has expanded its levels of cooperation. It was previously quite a narrow security focused organisation, but now the treasurers and finance ministers of the Five Eyes countries and other key ministers have been having their own coordination, and on things like Hong Kong and Xinjiang and other issues with the Chinese Communist Party have been issuing joint statements of concern. Now that is essentially the political and foreign policy element that's being formed there. The only thing that's missing is the economic element, and I think that's our task, is to secure these agreements, and everything else will build upon that. In a funny way, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is it's organising the world against it. By its aggressive approach, it is demonstrating to all of us the things that we have in common and the virtues of us working together. And that's particularly important for middle-sized countries, for middle powers, who don't have the weight of a superpower to fall back on. We need to network closer together in that multilateral way that Erin is talking about to secure all of our own sovereignty and all of our own freedom. So this is the time to seize the opportunity.
And Alicia, you, this is really your bag. It's a question from Raghav and builds on what James was just saying. What are your thoughts on semi-uniting some of the Royal Navy's high commands, some of the port sharing, some of the sort of military aspects that allow us to make sure that we're not just becoming a middling power on the global stage? And have we got, is there a level to which there could be a formal alliance in the South Pacific between the, ANZAC and the UK?
So just before I go on to that, I just want to quickly add, in addition to the points that Erin and James made, the one thing we haven't made is we've made the stake for why politicians and people want it, but we have to remember that businesses want CANZUK to work as well. All of our businesses want greater mobility for their workforces. The area has trade value something like $3.5 trillion. So I think it's really important that we remember that this isn't just a political kind of aspirational piece. This is really important for our businesses, for the bottom line, essentially. And it is really important also for defence. I'm not at this point convinced, and Erin and James may disagree with me, that we need a formal defence agreement, because the fact is we have the Five Eyes intelligence, and Five Eyes intelligence is a core that unites every single piece of work that we do. Even when you're working within bigger kind of political or military alliances, it's still the Five Eyes that come together for separate meetings on the sideline, as Erin was saying. We already share high commands. We have Five Eyes secondees within pretty much every single major command that we have within our ports. The level of our work together on military cannot be underestimated, but it is also not necessarily that well known publicly. But it is the most important tenet of our national security, without question, is the Five Eyes relationship. And that is why we have to invest in it mercilessly. We have to be proud of it. We have to protect it. And that's why I'm not necessarily open to extending it beyond the Five Eyes at this point in time. But absolutely, CANZUK, the UK is taking more of an interest in the South Seas for obvious reasons. And that is something that will be welcome by other CANZUK partners. But it doesn't need a formal alliance or partnership to do that. We are already in the right place. We already have the right mechanisms to support each other.
Wonderful. And as we sort of come to an end now, I'm just going to hand it back to each of you for 30 seconds or so to give me the one major reason that you think this is a good idea for each of our countries, and maybe create a better union for the future of the world as well. So James, I'm going to head to you first, Alicia then to you, and then Erin, finish up with you.
Thanks, Matt. Very briefly, this is an old idea whose time has come. And as every day moves on, and as the geopolitical environment becomes less and less certain, its need will become more and more apparent, and supporters will pile on. So we can all say that we were here early as the support grows from here.
So this for me is about aspiration, it's about opportunity, it's about affinity, it's about trust, and it's about security. And those are 5 things that all our nations want, all our nations need. And CANZUK, as James said, the idea has had its time has finally come. So we need to step forward. This is a time of opportunity for the UK. Let's step forward and not make any mistakes and grasp the most important opportunities and affinities before us.
Erin as well, over to you.
Well, what's interesting, I was reading a few months ago the Iron Curtain speech from Winston Churchill after he lost the election right after the end of the World War II. And in that speech, right after the formation of the United Nations, he warned that if the United Nations started turning into a bit of a Tower of Babel, that it was up to the Anglosphere, it was up to those English-speaking peoples, as he would describe it, to step up and be a counterbalance in global affairs. And I think that time is now, as James has highlighted so well, the need for powers to align, to express our shared commitment to the rule of law, to human rights, and to a rules-based approach to global trade and other things. I think with the rise of China and the failures of the United Nations on several levels, it's up to smart multilateralism through like-minded countries. And I can't think of a better grouping of world-leading democracies than Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK to do more together. How formalized that is will really depend on when the parties come together and speak. But I think it's time, and I think the world needs this type of multilateralism of an aspirational quality.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you so much, by the way, for all of you for joining us and for you joining us at home as well. It is a real privilege actually to join this as a chair. I've been following this issue for a number of years, and I never thought it would be one of those issues that actually captured the mainstream attention. I always thought it was going to be one of those ones that we always did on the outside, but it's so glad to see it become a major issue and a major plank of campaigns right across the world. And as I look forward to your campaign, Erin. I look forward to you taking the fight to President Trudeau and ensuring that more Canadians hear about this an idea. And hopefully, once the election in New Zealand is finished as well, we'll be able to talk to some Kiwis about the idea as well. But, thank you very much, James. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Erin, for joining us. And yes, winter is coming, but CANZUK is coming too. Have a nice day, everybody.